Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, You Got Hacked, Now What? I'm June Nijar, Product Manager here at Armor, and I'll be your host for today's broadcast. Before we start, just want to go over some housekeeping tips. Everyone is currently on mute and will remain so throughout the recording. Please use the chat window to inform us of any audio or technical issues. If you experience sound issues, we recommend calling in via phone instead, or using your instead of using your computer's audio. We'll conduct 2 live polls throughout the webinar, so please join. We'd love to hear from you. And throughout the webinar, please use the question feature to ask about any of the topics being discussed. Today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to an edited version will be sent to all attendees post-event. So with us today, we have Carlin Dornbush. He is CISSP certified and the president of American Cybersecurity Management. We also have Sean Tuma, who is the co-chair of the Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Practice Group and partner at Spencer Fain. So the agenda today is to talk about the life after a hack. So the first point here is, how did this happen? At a high level, what are hackers doing today? We'll be talking about now what. In this scenario, we will walk through a hypothetical breach and discuss a plan of action for the near term or short term. We'll also be talking about learning from mistakes, pivoting from a reactive remediation to proactive risk mitigation and enhanced security. And then we'll leave some time at the end for some Q&A as well. So the first section here, how did this happen? Before we go in to the presentation, just want to go ahead and take a couple minutes here to do a poll. We have a poll question here for you. You should be seeing that on your screen soon. So what do you think the financial impact of ransomware has been over the course of 2020? $200 million, $2 billion, $20 billion, or $200 billion? We're stuck with the twos, but it's going to be interesting to see what the actual answer to this question is. Let's see here. So what were the results? So just kind of going over the results here. It looks like majority of the folks on the line felt either 2 billion or 20 billion was kind of the sweet spot. Some people, actually almost a quarter of the audience, said 200 billion. So it's, yeah, I mean, obviously I think everybody here on the line understands that ransomware costs a lot of money. So yeah, everybody for the most part is in the billion and up range. So yeah, the correct answer is 20 billion. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment here. So if you joined us for the Armor Game of Code Level Up or Get Wrecked webinar, you'll remember Yaz Johnson covered threat actor profiles and what motivates them to be threat actors to attack, right? If you haven't seen that presentation, I highly recommend it. Definitely can find it on armor.com. Feel free to ask questions here. If you want to go ahead and get a direct link, we can share that. But I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the types of threat actors today. We'll be talking about the top types of threats these threat actors are executing on. And so, again, I'm not going to read the entire slide deck here. The point is that, there are, these are the top types of threats or types of attacks. Ransomware, being able to capitalize on employees reusing their passwords on multiple different platforms, and being able to attack, or threat actors are attacking remote employees in this current remote workforce environment that we're in today. Obviously, you can see it's really, really expensive. I mentioned $20 billion is the cost of ransomware from a global perspective. just across the year 2020. So tremendously, very, very expensive, and also an attack that is exploited quite often. So Carlin, do you have any thoughts or comments on these types of attacks, what you're seeing when you're working with your customers, just kind of, about the threat landscape?
Yeah, thanks, June. It's funny that we can see such small activity where maybe a CFO has used the same password for his social media platform as well as, say, his company email. And that just very quickly turns into an email compromise, and then things start to escalate from there. And that can lead to, these very numbers that you see here. You could have a significant data breach hitting you at nearly $4 million just because of this one little thing. So, people need to remain diligent, attend all that cybersecurity training. It's not crazy stuff. It actually means something. So that employee password reuse, I think, is a really significant one, and we're seeing that time and time again, and that leads to ransomware, the email compromise, very extended dwell times where these bad actors are now, years ago it used to be they were in for minutes, days, and now they're sitting there for 6 months or more. And they're really starting to learn the mechanisms of your organization and starting to use that against the businesses to extract funds. So it can be extremely significant.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can even make the argument that all of these top threats right here, or threats in general, they all kind of like weave into each other, right? Because password reuse can lead to compromise, can lead to malware. Remote employees can lead to ransomware or malware because they don't have the security knowledge to not click on random things. So all these things, it's just interesting that these are the top attacks, but again, they kind of weave into each other and complement each other, unfortunately. So let's see, John, the way that you're involved in cybercrime, the world of cybercrime, and your clients is from a legal perspective, right?
Yeah.
And so can you just kind of share a little bit about your thoughts on these top threats? And hey, maybe even share, like, have any of your clients been exposed to any of these specific types
All
of
of them. Yeah, thank you, June. So I'm sure a lot of people may be wondering, what does a lawyer have to do with cybersecurity and incident response? Number one, the reason you know about all these companies getting hit many times is because there are legal obligations, legal and regulatory requirements for disclosing these things, notifying individuals, business partners, whatnot. But really, more importantly, God, and then there's this other issue lawyers love to sell called the attorney-client privilege, which really isn't everything it's made up to be, but I'll just leave it at that. My role day in and day out is what's called a breach coach. And so roughly, 85, 90% of my work is serving as a breach coach to guide companies through the incident response process from a head coach point of view. And what that means is, we're seeing all of these things you're talking about right here. For example, as I sit here today, we have a couple of active ransomware negotiations that are going on. One a $500,000 demand, one a $10,000. So I mean, it covers the gamut, right? And what we're seeing is ransomware cases are coming in from what you've got right here, employee password misuse, the bad guys getting a hold of someone's password to get in, and access admin controls or whatnot. Very common. Seeing it come in through remote desktop. So RDP access, public facing RDP accounts for about 50% of the ransomware cases we're seeing right now. Business email compromise cases, I can almost guarantee you when I get one of these cases, if one party's using Microsoft Office 365 and they're not using MFA on it, multi-factor authentication, that's the one that got hit, because we just see it over and over and over. So, to that last point on your prior slide, that indicated that most of these attacks are a result of human error, not software problems. I've handled at a minimum hundreds, probably thousands of incidents since I've been doing this since 1999. I cannot think of maybe 2 or 3 cases that have been software code type errors. Everything else is preventable by human behavior. And so that's why education, preparation, as Carlin said, that cybersecurity training, that preparation, it's so critical because these are things we can protect against if we do it proactively.
Absolutely, absolutely. And hey, thanks, Sean, for that insight. So as promised, don't want to talk about, spend the lion's share of today's webinar talking about, how things happen. The title is "You Got Hacked, Now What?" Right? So let's get to now what. Now we do have another poll question here that we want to go ahead and just kind of get some insights from the folks on the line. So if we can get the poll question up on the screen. It looks like, I believe it's there now. So the question is, what do you think the typical duration is to resolve an incident? And so the point is like, hey, there has been an actual breach. How long does it take to go ahead and what is that process? What's the length of that process? How long does it take to go ahead and get over that breach? Think big picture. It's really interesting to see. Yeah, so the poll results are in, and it looks like so. So this is really, really interesting, and I think it has to do with how the question was asked. So maybe it's a little bit of a trick question.
June, if it were 7 days, I'd be flipping hamburgers at McDonald's for a side job.
Yeah, so most folks on the line here today said that the typical duration or average duration to resolve an incident is either 20 days, so a little over a quarter of the audience here said 20 days, and then almost 40% of the audience said 78 days. And I think what they're thinking is more along the lines of dwell time. And so you'd be surprised to see that the actual typical duration to resolve the breach from a big picture perspective is more than 365 days. And we'll touch on that actually here. I think I have control again here. So on this slide here.
June, let me make a comment about that poll question because I think it's really going to be important for our technical folks.
Yeah.
And that is, most of you are in a position where you're needing resources and budget, and you're needing to persuade CFO, directors, whomever to give you money to do it. After an incident's resolved, you have about a 90-day window where they're still feeling the sting of it. After that 90-day window passes, it gets the sting starts to go away. So for all the proactive things you need to get in place, you need to move quickly and be ready to run within that period.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're looking at a breach response timeline here. So I see a bunch of boxes. I see some time references here. And so, yeah, I mean, Sean, what am I looking at here? What does this mean?
So this is obviously it's very generic in a sense in that every incident is going to be different. Every breach is going to be different. And from a legal standpoint, I actually use the terms incident and breach differently. I don't use the term breach until we know there's actually been a compromise of the confidentiality of some type of sensitive information. That's a legal aside. The point of this timeline really is to show two things. One, how quickly you must be prepared to react to identify the problem, or to identify you have a problem and begin responding to it, which means you have to be prepared ahead of time to do it properly. Two, it shows how long these things can go on and what an impact from both a financial and a disruption of your organization it can cause because of having to deal with all of these things. And it shows just some of the key points that have to be done in the middle. And what I would tell folks is, a lot of times we see breaches, we see incidents that are manageable, but aren't handled properly within that first hour, 12 hours, 24 hours. And that causes problems that linger throughout the whole thing. So being prepared can help you keep a molehill instead of becoming a mountain. Now, not all of them, fall into that category. Some you just can't help. But what it really, and Carlin's going to speak more to this, but really, how do you know you have a problem? That's a huge issue. How are you hearing about it? What do you do first? Hopefully you have an incident response plan in place. Hopefully you don't come in and start wiping data and reacting without thinking and bringing in true experts to help you. You've got to think evidence preservation. One of the key points here is going to be notifying your insurance carrier, which we're going to talk about a little bit moving forward. But then, from a legal standpoint, your notification obligations, you got to know as soon as possible whether you have an incident or whether you have a breach that's going to require notifications and disclosures. You need your professionals in, someone like Carlin, to come in and help you answer those questions a lot of times. And then obviously your restoration, your recovery. And then, even if you do everything right, you can still be you are going to get inquiries from a lot of regulators. If you have to do notifications, you may get class action litigation. We've got a couple of those usually at any given time. So there's just a lot here. And what it shows you is you've got to think about this stuff ahead of time and prepare for it ahead of time. You can't wait till it happens to start trying to figure it out.
Yeah, and I think also what we're seeing here is kind of going back to the poll question, right? It's not just 7 days, 20 days, 78 days. You might be able to maybe squish the bug, if you will, right? From a technical perspective when it comes to an incident, an event, a breach. But there are a lot of implications and a lot of outcomes that are outside of purely the technical part, right, of experiencing a breach. And so I don't know, Carlin, is that something that you can talk to us about? I mean, I know you do the technical stuff quite a bit. How does all of this kind of tie into the rest of what we're seeing here?
Yeah, you bet. I think this is a pretty good list. It's obviously not exhaustive for our audience, as your mileage will vary based upon the type of data that you have. HIPAA, you're going to probably want to find out just access, right? Now caused an incident. So I think very early on here in hour one is critically important to know. How did we know that we went from an event to an incident? These two hosts talk to each other and they never should speak to each other, right? Because our monitoring technology is set up correctly. Or maybe we've gotten a phone call from a third-party vendor to say, guess what? Our technology was breached and you're using our technology. And so now, we're starting our investigation. So guess what? The timer just started ticking for you as a business. So and then, if you are under certain regulation, I mentioned HIPAA, but let's say GDPR, you're probably going to have to compress this even more down to that 72 hours, because you're going to potentially have, depending on how big it is and the countries in which those employees or consumers reside, you're going to have to start that notification either to your DPA and or to the individuals themselves. So knowledge is really, really key. And I think, gathering as much information, being able to correlate the events together, right, and stitch together what happened as fast as you can is going to be incredibly valuable so that the business now can start making those decisions. Who all else do we need to get involved? Do we need to pull in third parties? Right? Maybe we've got a big enough team and we can handle this ourselves, or we've got the right skill sets and we've been able to contain this and we've been able to validate that we've been able to contain it so we can continue down the rest of the life cycle with the process. So, I think this is a very good list, and I know Sean spends a lot of time, going through all this, and then you've got this really small bullet at the end here called litigation, right? And so a good example of how just a small piece of text here can be quite sizable, right? To, if this is a U.S. based actor, then a prior employee or something to that effect, then that element alone can stretch this timeline out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, Carl made a great point that this isn't even taking into consideration the timeline requirements from different compliance regulators or different types of just regulations in general, right? Whether they're local within the state, interstate within the United States, different states. New York has their own requirements, California has their own, and that's only going to become more and more common, right? As well as you mentioned GDPR, so you're talking about international. If you have a global presence, this list gets long real quick, right? And yeah, there's a lot of other components, and just like you said, litigation. Double click on that, and that's got its own timeline and list.
Years.
All that.
It
Right.
goes for years, and one, so what that shows is the need to know ahead of time, who are your regulators? Who are you regulated by? And the other is you've got to know your contracts, because every contract these days is going to have some requirement for dealing with data and the security and the privacy and incidents involving it. But one, a lot of people don't think about. So like when we talk about the risks that come about from having an incident, we talk about the cost, right? Forensics, bringing in Carlin and his team, legal, we don't work for free. We like to get paid for what we do. So there's costs there. We talk about notification cost. We're looking at $3, $4, $5 per person many times to just send out notifications. We're talking about the cost of providing the credit monitoring, things like that, which are included in the notification costs. There's all these different costs. Then we talk about litigation costs, which can get hundreds of thousands or millions very quickly. One that people don't think about often, that is something that applies to so many businesses, is PCI. PCI is so important because it is a certainty. If you're within the PCI framework and you're governed by that, the card brands don't have to ask you for permission. They don't have to ask you to send them money. They take it out of your account at the appropriate time because they're entitled to do so contractually. And your card brands, usually you're processing agreements with your merchant bank or whomever you have that agreement with, require notice immediately of an incident. It doesn't go into more detail. If you have an incident, you're required to notify them immediately. And if you don't do that, they're going to hit you on the back end with those PCI assessments. So you have to know what your agreement provides. You need to have that contract, which I can't tell you how many clients we spend 2, 3 days, 4 days trying to just find the agreements to see which one's in play, to then find who to notify, how to notify. Is it courier pigeon? Is it fax? Is it FedEx? You never know. I mean, but you could have all this in place ahead of time. And so, then they may mandate different investigation procedures as you move forward. So these are all the kind of things you have to know and be prepared for in your incident response planning. And I did see a question, June. I don't know if you want to answer that now.
I'm looking at the questions, and I think I think it may make more sense as we go through the rest of today's discussion, because I think we could tie it to some of the stuff we have going on later.
Okay.
So you know, we brought up some really interesting points. But again, the title of today's webinar is "You Got Hacked, Now What?" So let's talk a little bit about that, right? Let's, you know, hey, this is a multi-year process. Okay, understand that. There's a lot of things you have to do. Okay, understand that. But hey, we got a breach today. What do I do now? Right? I mean, maybe I don't have an IRP. Maybe I don't. We haven't had this discussion in my organization, or maybe we had the discussion, but we haven't necessarily defined everything yet. So, like, what can I do now to go ahead and stop the bleeding? So I don't know, Carlin, maybe this is something that you can kind of chime in on and help us understand, like, what are the steps and what's important and what some of these boxes here mean.
Yeah, you bet. And I think these are some of the good steps here. One of the things we really want to make sure people do is really not tamper with the data. So as you're going through that discovery, get into all your systems where it's read only, right? And start correlating these events together. Don't start making drastic changes to your environment. If now let's say you've been ransomware and we've got system down and things like that, that's great. As you go through triaging this, you're obviously looking for backups. We want to make sure that you've access wasn't granted. Maybe the threat actor got into an environment, they escalated privilege, and now they're into your backups. That's something you're going to want to be looking for, right? Was there nefarious activity on that side of the fence? Hopefully you've got these backups under control and they're fairly recent, right? And they're restorable. And now what you're going to need to do is start looking at another environment in which to go through the restoration process. Do not restore right on top of the data that you have. We want to preserve that data so that forensics can come in and determine what really happened here and understand the behaviors. And understanding those behaviors will help us understand the type of threat actor and from whence they came. Right. So what was this, just an email compromise from Nigeria, or was this a disgruntled employee at their home, tearing down your systems? So there's going to be all types of data that we're going to be able to pull, and we're going to want to sort through all that. So when you look at that data recovery and restoration process, you're most likely going to want to push that into another area. Getting a hold of your insurance carrier, absolutely. You want to have information ahead of time, right, that you've collected before you just pick up that phone, but they're also going to be able to help you. So they're not just sitting there waiting to collect money from you annually and so forth. They're actually going to be of assistance. And then you're going to be starting to implement some of that interim security. So maybe there are other controls that you're going to be able to put in place immediately. If you don't have 2FA on, boy, you better be turning that on right away. What we're trying to do is stop that activity, not letting it spread east to west throughout other environments. We're also going to be looking north-south to see if there's escalation or privilege. So we're going to want to be shutting that down as well. So turning on the additional security controls, which you might have said, well, we didn't really want to do that because it's a lot more expensive to do and so forth. Well, guess what? We're probably going to start tuning up some security controls right away.
Right.
And it may just be for a period of time, but we want to, you're right, certainly contain this acting and then starting to get you under the restoration process.
Absolutely. And so I see, box 3, if you will, right here, notify key business partners. I don't know, Sean, who are business partners?
So they can be anybody. And I want to mention something to Carlin's point about restoring over the original environment. I can't tell you the number of cases we've had that were ransomware cases where we had a known threat actor who we knew we could negotiate a low price with. We had insurance in place to pay the price to get the decryptors, but I'll use air quotes, IT guy, who is probably not a person that is on this webinar today, because if they were, they wouldn't be my air quotes IT guy. Which I mean like the friend of a brother-in-law of a cousin who will work for a six-pack on a Saturday night guy. They come in and they immediately wipe the environment, they wipe the data, and then we have nothing to decrypt. And so we can get the keys, we can get them restored, but we have nothing to decrypt because they have just taken the patient laying there on the operating table and stabbed the dagger right through their heart because they had no idea what they were doing. So that's when you then really have to notify your key business partners. So we do a lot of healthcare breaches, a lot of healthcare ransomwares. Many times it's the MSP getting hit. That then has all of its customers who are healthcare providers. So you've obviously got to notify them because they're your covered entities under your business associates agreement. We have cases where we're representing business associates that have to then notify their covered entities under the GDPR scheme, where we may be a data processor who has to notify the data controller. All of these come about through your contracts. We may be in a situation where we have the intellectual property for another company, trade secrets, whatnot, that we're hosting. So you've got to put them on notice immediately. I've already talked about your PCI issues. Really, it's just a product of all of these contracts that people are signing, and they're not including anyone from their technical team in this, so they don't know what they're agreeing to, and they need to know this. And so, that's a big issue. Really, from my perspective as a breach coach, what I see the biggest problem with is the lack of understanding of the role your insurance provider, your insurance carrier plays in this process. Because number one, I think everyone should have cyber insurance now because of the cost that all of this takes. And depending on, I saw a question about retentions or deductibles. Look, we're very rarely are we seeing a case under 50 grand. Most are in the hundreds of thousands now. So you need enough coverage to cover that. I mean, we're negotiating a $500,000 ransomware payment today. That's a lot of money, right? But what people don't understand is these insurance policies typically have language that controls who you can use as your breach coach, who you can use as your forensics firm, as in Carlin and his team, who you can use for negotiating maybe your ransomware, your data restoration aspect, PR firms, forensics accounting.
That actually ties into a couple questions
Yeah.
that are here, right? I mean, I'll just go ahead and ask them since we're on the topic right now. Could you speak to the business considerations regarding ransomware payments, and how does the FBI currently view that?
Yes, so the FBI will tell you, because this is their policy and their stance, that they don't encourage the payment of ransoms. And I totally understand why. From a practical consideration, though, usually the cases we see, they either involve a ransom where there were backups, or where the backups were either deleted forensically or encrypted, or they just didn't have them, and we see that, or they weren't configured properly and they can't be restored. They hadn't been tested, right? And so typically, if you have backups of your data, you're not going to pay the ransom unless they have also exfiltrated sensitive data from your environment and they're now extorting you with that. That is something we see on a regular basis. And then you need to know what type of data they may have. And that's a difficult question. When a business does not have backups and it's critical data that's been encrypted, if they have the ability to pay, in all but one case that I can think of, has a client said, no, I'm not going to pay as a matter of principle. We have companies we work with that are experts in doing nothing but negotiating with these threat actors. They know their negotiation patterns. They know their demands. They know how frequently they're going to respond. They know their reliability on getting a decryptor. They know if they're going to be prone to re-extort, all of these things. So we're able to give good data to a client to allow them to make their own informed decision. But the FBI plays a critical role in this, because one of the points you're going to remember from that timeline is getting OFAC clearance before you make a ransom payment. Okay, the U.S. Department of Treasury has a list of parties that you are prohibited from even negotiating with, because they're known terrorist groups. They're on the sanctioned countries list, like Iran or North Korea. And so you have to do a clearance check on what's called the Office of Foreign Assets Controls list. That's OFAC through Treasury, before you can even agree to make one of these payments. Now, it's critical to report this to the FBI and understand they're not here to be your IT provider. They're here to investigate crimes. So they may not be able to jump in, or they may, it depends, right, on a case-by-case basis. But you need to report this to them, because if you have a case where you have to pay a ransom and it's critical to your business, and the party is on that OFAC prohibited transactions list, one of the elements of getting a license, if you will, from Treasury is you have to report it to the FBI and include them in this process. And then you have to make the case.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is it's not necessarily the FBI saying you can't do something, but there is a process, and that's its own timeline, right?
Yeah, they're not saying you can't. There's nothing as of right now that makes it illegal. There's talk, but nothing yet, unless they're on the OFAC prohibited list.
Also don't encourage it
Right.
for obvious reasons, right?
Yeah.
So actually, we've got limited time here, and actually Sean and Carlin, we've talked about this offline many times. This could easily be a 2 to 5 hour discussion here.
Oh, yeah.
So, but I do want to kind of move us along here, because we still have a lot of content to talk about. So here we talked about, hey, short term, right? What do I do now? But really what I would like to go ahead and pivot to is, it ties into a lot of what you're talking about here, Sean and Carlin, like learning from mistakes, or how do we pivot to being proactive? You don't necessarily have to have experienced a breach to get to this stage right here, but it's interesting, more often than not, you see organizations getting here after having gone through a breach. Hopefully we can convince you that it makes more sense to do it proactively. But with that said, again, Sean, I think you were touching on a lot of this already as it is, right? Planning is a really, really big and must-have component of being prepared for a breach or incident. Being able to execute that plan, and then being proactive again about reviewing and updating and keeping these incident response plans current, right? So I won't again read off all the bullets here, but I think would love to get Carlin your thoughts on kind of the planning phase of it, how you work with organizations to help them with planning, and also the execution and revamp as well. Right.
Yeah. So much can be bolted into and encapsulated into that incident response plan, right? From really defining, what that incident is, where we would define incidents. So that kind of comes down to your scope. Building out those roles and responsibilities is really, really key. And that's something that organizations don't spend probably enough time thinking about. It's, oh yeah, well, we're going to call Bob, when we have the issue. And is Bob available, and who's Bob's secondary, and does Bob have everything he needs to execute his job, and so forth. So you really need to start thinking through the broad set of roles. You're going to have somebody play that incident manager role. You're going to have somebody deal with communications, and those are different skill sets, right? You're going to have somebody, doing the technical work to contain the nefarious actors, as well as starting to do some of that cleanup work. So there's actually a lot of roles that get played. And once again, these are roles. These are not individuals. And sometimes an individual can play more than one role, and that's perfectly fine. But you want to be really clear about the roles and how they're going to start to interact with each other. You'll also start to build out a lot of these activities in an action list. And so, where is our disaster recovery plan? Let's talk about business continuity. Where are all the backups that we're going to need for these particular systems that have been impacted? Maybe, a lot of this is cloud-based service, right? And so you're going to have to work with a third party that's providing those services to let them know that they've, created an impact for your environment, or you've created an impact for their environment. So there's a lot to sort through there, going through the triage process, and knowing who are we going to call. Let's have a list of actual phone numbers that we're going to call for these incidents, from legal, breach coaching, forensics, just standard security. Also, maybe from an HR perspective, you've got to loop folks in. You're going to have to probably bring in maybe the fire department, if, depending on what that incident actually has cost. We spent a lot of time working with IoT environments and municipalities as they're managing water and waste treatment plants. And so dealing with those types of incidents, now you're starting to escalate into some physical environment. You've got public safety to deal with, right? CCTV preservation is important. So there's really a lot in individuals in a business's landscape that they're going to have to consider. So working through that, writing all this down is really important. Taking the time. Let's pause things for just a minute. Let's get the right people in the right room. Let's start documenting this. Put our heads together. Let's be creative also about how we're going to go about through these executions. And then we like to tabletop with folks. And this is a really nice, safe way where we can get around the table, or the virtual table, as we've got now, and start to work through some of these scenarios and start to role play. And the businesses will start to say, hey, guess what? Let's kind of tune this a little bit. Oh, we should probably publicize that information. Let's make that a little bit more available on our SharePoint system. Let's make sure some additional resources have access to some of this monitoring technology that we have in place, so that we've got some of that secondary role in resourcing we can go to. So
Absolutely.
those are some kind of quick tips there.
Yeah, and so there's an interesting question here, and it ties to what we talked about at the very, very beginning. I mean, there's all these different types of threat actors, a bunch of different types of attacks. Some are related to each other. Some are kind of outliers that may have, a nuanceable difference than some of the other types of attacks. But at the end of the day, how do you write good policy around incident response and disaster recovery when the types of incidents have such a range of recovery times and just residual fallout?
Yeah, good question. I think, first of all, hopefully you've done a risk assessment in your business. We would like to play back to the risk register that was created as a result of that, so that we can really focus on high risk systems, that in high risk data. So our organization always likes to work with the business and trace, where is this data? What data classifications do you have? If you don't have that, then we'll obviously help you build it. But let's get into some of that higher level and higher risk data, so that we can focus on that first, and the systems that are housing that, collecting that data, or disseminating that data, so that that's a priority. Then we can work our way down to kind of medium level and lower level systems. So we really want to focus on that first, because and that also helps you balance your investment of security controls, right, around your environment. So let's don't spend a lot of money on lower risk environments, and let's kind of balance that and make sure that we're focused on the right sides.
Yeah,
And
June, let me jump in here for another. I agree with everything Carlin said. That's what I see as well. From my perspective of the role I play, there are three reasons for an incident response plan. One, because you need a well-documented plan in place to satisfy regulators. If you ever have an incident, they're going to want to have known that you have a nice, impressive, indexed, beautiful, polished incident response plan. Two, cyber insurance is probably going to ask about this, and that's going to factor into what kind of coverage you're getting for what amount. So that's your first, to document, paper the file,
yeah.
impress your board of directors, right? The second, and this goes to what Carlin was talking about, the tabletops, is it's a great tool for training your key people to get ready to know their roles in the event you have an incident. So using it for training while you're developing it, and then while you're tabletopping it. And one of my favorite techniques in a tabletop when I'm doing them is I have the key person everybody relies on a vacation to a digital detox island where they can't be reached. Now everybody else has to buy in and think. But then there's a third reason for having an incident response plan, and that's actually using it to respond to an incident. Now, out of 21 years of doing this, I can't think of one case where we've actually pulled out the binder and started flipping through it in a real incident response. In that case, you need what Carlin was talking about, that one pager that you may create sitting around the table of a conference room with a whiteboard, where you just take a picture of it and you identify your key risks and you say, if something happens, who are we going to call? How do we reach them? Give me 2 emails, give me personal phone, give me assistant, text message, whatnot. Because when you have a real incident, that's what you're going to need the most. You're going to have your insurance information on there, your policy number, their 1-800 line, your broker, those things, because communications and getting your team to the field to play is what matters then. And it's got to be streamlined and it's got to be quick. And one of the most critical things I've seen one client come up with that I've adopted is they've created a text message group of their key control people, both internally and externally, because cybersecurity is a team sport. You need all of us to do this right. And so with one text, they can say, hey, we need to hop on a call in 15 minutes to that text group, and it's invaluable.
Yeah. So there's a question here that's really, really interesting. And it's one of those types of questions that it's like you pull the thread and just unravels everything. So it's a question, but I won't ask it as a question. I'll make it just as a comment. I just like what it says. So the question that is the comment for this purpose is anyone ever prepared? We see incidents in the news all the time, and the speakers here yourselves, you see even more that never make it to the news. So is anyone ever prepared? I'll ask y'all to just kind of think about that and not comment. but I mean, I understand where this person is coming from, and I guess
one more. Is anyone secure?
right. You know what? We are really short on time, but if you had 15 seconds to go ahead and just comment on that, what would you say?
I would say no. I mean, when FireEye got hit in December, all the rest of us need the humility to know none of us are secure.
It doesn't mean give up the game.
That's right.
Still pay attention, right? You've got to be persistent. And like we said, even small cracks in the armor can lead to really big change. So stay vigilant.
Absolutely. So I think we talked about a lot of different things in terms of an incident response plan. One we didn't really press too hard on or dive too deep on was the technology component of it, right? There's people, there's process, and then there's technology. And so this is just something for the audience to take into consideration when they're looking at any solution. So at a high level, you want to understand kind of like the key buckets over here on the left, risk, outcome, solution, visibility. And when you're looking at these different sections, I guess, You want to understand, what are the differentiators? What are the things within that bucket that are really, really important to you? Again, we're really short on time, so I don't want, I don't think we can spend a lot of time on this slide here, but feel free to take a screenshot, just something for you to think about, right? And obviously this will be on the recording as well. So let's see, with that said, just kind of moving forward, I would be remiss if I didn't at least touch on Armor and what it is that we do. So Armor is a cloud security company. We make cloud security and compliance simple, achievable, and manageable across any environment. Armor safeguards your workloads, cloud, endpoints, container images, network, and server environments against malicious threats while providing insights into security risks you may face. Customers who use Armor benefit from a consolidated security platform that drives down the cost, risk, and the need for resources to manage multiple point solutions or point security solutions. So Armor is all about keeping you safe, and we know security and compliance are complex, as we just discussed throughout this whole presentation, right? We want to make it so that it doesn't feel that way for you. So, we have some key takeaways here from the presentation. I know we went through a lot of stuff. We knew going into this that an hour was not going to be enough. So if you didn't, if we blaze through something too quick, at least remember these key takeaways right here. Cyber attacks are increasing and they are expensive, right? As we discussed earlier. Different types of threats. There are specific types of threats that are being used more, a lot of automation to go ahead and execute these different types of attacks. So yeah, the attacks are increasing, and there's more and more incentive for threat actors to go ahead and be threat actors and to execute on these attacks. With that said, failure to prepare is preparing to fail. Like that question asked earlier, is anybody ever prepared? You're right. You're not going to be able to go ahead and just stand there and deflect every different type of attack. But again, having some thought process, having a process is going to be better than having nothing at all, right? We had a slide here saying, hey, you don't have a process. Well, what do you do right now? That's only going to help you so much. And again, it's about being prepared with a plan that can be adaptable to the various different types of attacks. Sean said this earlier, mountains out of molehills, and this actually kind of ties into the second bullet here as well. There is an opportunity that if you are completely unprepared or not even thinking about security or compliance or risk from an IT perspective, that a small problem can become a huge problem. Let's keep those molehills, right? And I think Sean even said, hey, there are just some problems that are just big problems no matter what you do. True, but I think this also applies to them. Those big problems could be even bigger if you have no plan, right? And ultimately what it comes down to is being able to protect your data and your applications and the information that is sensitive, that has to do with your business, your intellectual property, your customers, payments, all those various different things. So moving forward here, just some resources. I'll touch on these real quick. If you want to learn more about why being a hacker is so cool right now, or why bad guys are doing what they're doing, the Dark Market Report is something you can download that really does a good job of sharing some insights on what is motivating threat actors and how are they navigating the dark web to go ahead and buy and sell their services and their goods, and et cetera. You can go to armor.com/demo to request a demo from Armor. And relevant for today's, a lot of the questions and what we're talking about today is, threat use cases, Armor's defense against ransomware. It's a really, really good read. Can dive into the ransomware topic specifically. Definitely encourage you to check that out. Some additional resources, I believe these are part of the handouts here. So yeah, definitely check out the incident response considerations from a breach coach from Sean Tuma, and then incident response plan offerings from Carlin at American Cybersecurity Management. So that leaves us with a whole 4 minutes with us blazing through that. for questions and answers. So with that said, let's see if we can go ahead and open up the Q&A here. We've got some questions.
We've had some good ones so far.
Very good.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'll mention, if we don't get to all of them, you can always reach out to us, and we're happy to answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I'll just put that on the screen here as well. This is the contact information for Sean and for Carlin. If you want to reach out directly about anything that they were talking about specifically today, or just in general, you have some, you want some clarity or just some additional direction, feel free to reach out to them. They've made themselves available to this audience.
June, I thought there was one good question here, kind of around, well, we've got a big deductible rate. And remember that folks need to remember that insurance is just one way to mitigate risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's fine. There's a lot you probably need to be doing besides just insurance, right? So take the steps beyond that. You need that monitoring. You need intrusion prevention, right? Not just detection. Managing your file systems and monitoring these environments, antivirus. And once you even do have all those systems, it's keeping them up to date and knowing that they've been kept up to date. We see that where systems have atrophied and the protections on those systems have atrophied. And so now we're not keeping up, and things are, you get this drift, if you will, that goes on in your environment. So I think when you go to the executives and you're talking about cyber insurance, I think you need to always go take a step up and remember that you're talking about risk and how you're managing that risk. And so go beyond just the insurance, and hey, there's probably some investment in process. And we've talked about that from an IRP perspective. And there's investment on product and technology. And then there's an investment in people as well. So let's make sure that we've got the right skills, or at least access to the right skills that we can get to.
Yeah,
so just
and let
another
me add
aspect.
to that. Cyber insurance is a quickly evolving market right now. And just within the last 3 months, we're seeing more demands being placed on these carriers because they're getting smashed with ransomware. And so your security factors into your ability to get cyber insurance now. Doing all those things Carlin just mentioned, if you're not doing a lot of that, you won't get coverage anymore, or you're going to have a $100,000 deductible. For example, within the last 3 weeks, a lot of carriers bonded together and said, if you don't have MFA in your environment, we're not writing coverage for you. A lot of the newer insurers are now running scanning tools on your environment, trying to help you proactively manage this risk. And so it's not an either or anymore. You've got to have your security to get your insurance.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, a lot of organizations historically have relied on insurance to be their security, right? If, hey, we get hit, we'll just call the insurance company, and whatever it costs us, insurance will pay for it. And to your point, Sean, that is dramatically changing, right?
Yeah.
Insurance companies have realized, like, hey, companies are in the news every day, and we're just getting pummeled, right, with claims.
Yeah, and remember, all insurance does is pays money. They don't get you your business back.
Right. Yeah.
You've got to do the security.
It's not only is it the right thing, now it's becoming a requirement, right? Yep. We're at the buzzer, but I do want to ask this question here. And it's specific to you, Sean. Does the breach need to be reported if the entity confirms no breach of sensitive data, and if not required? What documentation do you recommend be maintained to support your conclusion for now reporting?
Okay, so in my world, we never call, so Carlin mentioned earlier, event, then incident. We treat everything as an event or an incident until we know there has been a compromise of the confidentiality of sensitive information, maybe personal, maybe business. That compromise of confidentiality is what triggers the use of the breach terminology. Now, not all laws, not all regulations follow that. Most do. So we're dealing with an incident until we trigger that. If you only have an incident, you typically do not have to disclose it unless it's a material impact and you're a public company or something like that, right? So we do a lot of cases. In fact, my biggest value to a client is to come in and tell them what they think is a breach really isn't. And we don't have to do all of this disclosure. In that case, what we do is we prepare a written risk assessment, not the kind that we're thinking about typically, but one of this incident in particular, to lay out the facts with the relevant legal standards and show that under those legal standards, there is no requirement for that kind of disclosure or notification or reporting. And so that's how you handle those situations.
Understood. Awesome.
Yep.
And so, yeah, we're a couple minutes over here. I know we're still, good chunk of the audience is still online. So clearly the stuff that y'all are talking about is really, really interesting and important, but I don't want to chew up the rest of the audience's day. So to kind of come to a conclusion here, right? I do want to give a special thanks to both you, Sean and Carlin, for joining us today. Again, everybody, feel free to take a screenshot of the contact information to reach out to them if you have any direct questions, because I know we didn't answer everything that was put into the chat, the question boxes. And yeah, again, thank you for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure spending the last hour with everyone, and I think a lot of the questions that came up today are really front of mind for a lot of the people out there, right? When they're looking at breaches in the news or just thinking about their own organization's risk appetite or their security posture, whatever it might be, right? And so, yeah, just appreciate all the insight from both of you. Appreciate the questions from the audience, and yeah, like I said again, feel free to reach out to the team here. That's the panel, as well as download some of the content from them directly, take advantage of the handouts, and take advantage of some of the content that we have on armor.com. So again, really appreciate it. We will see you at the next online or hopefully in-person event. Hope everybody has a great day.
Thank y'all.
Thank you. Cheers.